Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Community Gathers event. I'm Richard Yep, the CEO of the American Counseling Association, and before we begin our program, I wanted to share some meeting notes with you. By now, we've all been in many Zoom sessions, but I wanted to make sure you were aware of what we're doing in this particular session. You're probably familiar with the two we'll be using the most. The chat feature allows you to post thoughts and reflections. The Q&A feature is the one where you can ask the panelists a question. Now, with hundreds of people registered for this session, we may not be able to respond to everyone during the event, but if you provide your contact information, we'll try to follow up afterwards. For this session, you'll be able to see the panelists, but the audience's cameras will be turned off and your mics will be muted. For those of you who've been on sessions where everyone is able to talk at the same time, you know why we follow this format. So if you have a tech support question, our team is standing by behind the scenes. So use the chat function or the raise hand feature if you need one of our techs to try and help you out. This event is being recorded, and we will reach out to all registrants next week when the link is available. We'll also provide you with some resource information at that time too. Continuing education is available for this event. For you to obtain the CE, there will be a survey link we post at the conclusion of the event that you'll need to complete in order to receive the CE receipt. So at this point, I'm very honored to get things started and to introduce the president of the American Counseling Association, Dr. Sue Pressman.
Thank you, Rich. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this very important gathering. I want to express my appreciation to our ACA presidential team, Dr. Heather Trepal and Dr. Kent Butler, for working on this project with me. I am also very honored to have such an outstanding group of panelists for tonight's event. Dr. Butler will be introducing them in just a few moments. I would also like to thank the ACA staff who helped to pull this event together on short notice as soon as the Governing Council supported this event. This event is co-sponsored by the American Counseling Association Foundation, and we express our appreciation for their support. Most importantly, I want to thank all of you who are with us. This event is really all about you. It was designed for you. It was produced with you in mind, and I am so grateful that we are able to provide you with a stellar group of counseling leaders who will be talking with you. Counselors and colleagues, we find ourselves at an extremely challenging and difficult time. Our society is facing pandemics. We are witnessing increasing incidents of police brutality against Black Americans, and the country is becoming more polarized as we confront institutional and systemic racism. Each day, it feels like the very fabric of our society is unraveling. The work we do for clients and students is so incredibly important. Frankly speaking, counselors are needed now more than ever. And I could never be more proud to be a counselor. However, we also need to acknowledge that many counselors are in crisis and need support. Many of us find ourselves questioning our ability to provide services to our communities. We often talk about the importance of self-care. We know that it is important for us to care for ourselves and be supportive of our colleagues. Care and compassion of our colleagues is important and can be quite powerful. This is one of the reasons for this event. ACA wanted you to hear from our fellow counselors who are experts in our field. We ask that they provide us with their perspectives as we face these challenges. We also want you to know what is on your mind, which is why you are encouraged to share thoughts and ask questions during this session. I want you to know that the American Counseling Association is committed to helping both members and non-members. We know that many of you are in pain at what we have been witnessing in terms of racism and discrimination. We know that we need to look at the institutional racism that even exists in our profession. To address these issues, let me share what the ACA Governing Council has done in just the past 4 months. Under immediate past president Heather Trepal, an ACA anti-racism writing group came together and crafted a heartfelt and action-oriented statement expressing our association's commitment to the elimination of racism and discrimination in all forms. We then joined with all of our ACA divisions and regions in support of town hall events to discuss these issues and to provide support to our colleagues. And as many of you know, ACA established an anti-racism action plan task force that was chaired by Dr. Butler. This group worked tirelessly for several weeks, and I will add that they met on Friday evenings this summer and then submitted recommendations to the Governing Council that looked at both short and long-term solutions that will combat racism. We've asked our staff for their thoughts on how a number of the proposals brought forth by the task force can be implemented immediately, and which ones can strategically be rolled out in the near future. I am proud of the action of our board, and I am confident that we will be successful in our efforts. So let me just reiterate how honored I am that so many of you have joined with us. I am proud to call you my colleagues and are both humbled and honored to be with you today. I am looking forward to what our panelists have to share and the questions from some of you. At this time, it is my privilege and it is my honor to turn things over to tonight's moderator, ACA President-elect, Dr. Kent Butler.
Thank you, Sue. President Sue Pressman, for your kind words and for bringing us into this space today. Thank you all for being a part of today's event, and just know that it's coming from our hearts that we are reaching out to you all so that we can provide our profession a space where we can all kind of come and heal ourselves while we're doing this very masterful work in the communities that we work in. And so I want to thank you all for being a part of this. In my thank you, I want to thank President Pressman, President Trepal for their support of this event, as well as Rich Yep, Brandy McIntyre, Natasha Rankin, Amy Smith, as well as the other staff members from ACA. And I'm really proud to hear that the ACA Foundation wanted to co-sign with us and be a sponsor of this event. And so it's a phenomenal thing. Today is about healing. It's a space for us as counselors to come together and be with one another in this trying time. And so in doing so, we would like to go into a moment of silence. And in this moment of silence, I would ask that you all think about the land in which you're standing upon and give honor and support to the indigenous communities that are around us and need to know that we understand that we're standing on the lands that they have so richly provided our opportunities to be on top of. And so I would also ask that you take the time to think about the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that it took to take a life. And while we're not here specifically for Black lives, I need you to understand that Black lives matter. And as an organization, we at ACA are definitely mindful of that. And we're taking into consideration the need for us to reach out to our brothers and sisters and make sure that we know and they know that we are there for them. So I ask you to take a moment of silence and be here for us. Thank you. Thank you so much. And as each of you all probably know, we are working in strange times in our homes, most of us working remotely with office mates and family mates that are going to be around and possibly making noises and things along those lines. So bear with us if any of those things should happen or occur. But at this time, I would like to introduce to you our panel. And each of them are going to come to you in their own way to say hello. And I'd like to start with Dr. Beverly O'Brien.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Beverly O'Brien. I am currently a counselor educator, a practitioner, a former school counselor, a past president of the American Counseling Association, the American School Counselor Association, and the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development. Good evening.
Thank you, Beverly. So happy to have you. Dr. Cortland Lee.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Cortland Lee. I'm a professor in the counselor education program at the DC campus of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. I'm a past president of the American Counseling Association, past president of the Division of Multicultural Counseling and Development. I'm also past president of the International Counseling Association as well. And I'm really honored to be part of this panel this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for your leadership and all the things that we stand upon your shoulders upon. Dr. Gerald Corey.
Jerry Corey here. You know, I started going to ACA in 1979 at Las Vegas, and I never missed a single conference until San Diego when they didn't have it. So 40 years of attending ACA. I'm currently far from retirement. I'm revising books and doing a fair amount of teaching, but online.
Thank you, Dr. Corey. We appreciate you, and we have all been benefited by the works that you have brought to the profession. Dr. Ebony White.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ebony. I am a counselor educator at Drexel University in Philadelphia, although I am a Jersey girl from Trenton, New Jersey. I'm also the advocacy chair for Counselors for Social Justice and the chair for the North Atlantic region of ACA. And I'm also really honored that I was asked to be on this panel this evening.
Thank you. And your work shows for itself, and you're one of the reasons why you're here. Thank you so much. Dr. Mark Scholl.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Scholl, and I'm going to echo what Ebony said in terms of it being a great honor to be a part of this distinguished panel. I'm an associate professor at Wake Forest University, and I represent the Association for Humanistic Counseling on the ACA Governing Council. The population that I primarily work with as a counselor back in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, is community ex-offenders, and I provide career counseling and career support services to those clients.
Thank you, Dr. Scholl. And one of my partners in crime in the MSJCCs, Dr. Annalise Singh.
Thank you, Dr. Butler. Hi, everyone. My name is Annalise. I use she and they pronouns. I'm in the land we now call New Orleans, which is originally Chitimacha land. I'm a queer, non-binary, mixed race, South Asian, light-skinned person of color. All those identities feel really important to speak into the room. I'm a practicing counselor. My work is mostly with queer and trans folks, working a lot with folks dealing with immigration issues, and former president of LGBT and SACES. Great to be in community. I feel like we're privileged to be on this panel, but the whole community that's gathered today are all the experts. So looking forward to some good dialogue in the chat box, and it's great to be here.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Dr. Selma Zagnaga.
Saludos desde la frontera. Greetings from the border of Mexico. I'm Selma Iznaga. I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. I am the founder of Texas Counselors for Social Justice and a past president of Counselors for Social Justice. Most of my work is with refugees and immigrants, and I consider it a great privilege to work with them and to work with you as well.
Thank you all so much for agreeing to be a part of this. And we have 405 people who are on this call at the moment. And I want you all to know that if I could have reached out to each and every single last one of you to be a part of this panel, I would have. And so I cherish the fact that you're here and that you want to be involved and you want to hear from the people that have assembled here today. And we want to be able to provide you with the opportunities to continue this conversation. So one of the things that I would like you to know is that at the end of this, when we end in about 2 hours, we're going to stay on the line for those of you who would like to continue the conversation and to talk just a little bit more about where you're coming from, giving you an opportunity to speak out and to talk. We want a place where you can bring yourself to healing and sharing your story in the true aspect of what we are here to do and be here for one another. And so I have my first question to the panel. This is a time where counselors are taking care of so many people, clients, family, friends, and more, and maybe neglecting their own mental health. Please help us understand why it's important for professional counselors to consider counseling.
Well, I'm going to start from a very practical point of view before we get into theory or anything else. And my position is what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And that is, if our position is that our skills are good for others, make a statistically significant difference in the lives of others, provide assistance in need, give help for others, to respect the concept of seeking help and understanding that it's a good thing, then why would we not do the same thing? You know, we cannot be our doctors to our own selves. We have to remember that what we learned or what we teach, when we ourselves are in distress, leave our heads. They're not always there. And so therefore, remembering that different cultures, age groups, genders, all have different ways of receiving and giving information is not necessarily at the forefront of your thinking when you're applying it to yourself. So I do believe seeking help from professionals is a good thing for us, as well as being there for others who need us.
Thank you. Yes, Mark.
I'm kind of reminded of the story by Virginia Satir, who would tell the story about the S-pot on her family farm. It was a big iron pot, and during one season it was filled with soap, and during another season it was filled with stew, and during yet another season it was filled with manure. And so she would use this as a metaphor for your feelings of self-worth and ask clients, how full is your pot? How full is your pot? And she would say that a counselor could be likened to a pot filler as opposed to a pot driller. Some of the stresses that we encounter in life are pot drillers, and the counselor is the pot filler. And she said that when your pot is high, integrity, compassion, honesty, love, empathy all flow easily from people to the people they serve.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, Dr. Lee.
Even when times are not as crazy and difficult as they are now, it's a good idea for us as professionals to seek counseling. Counseling is about really helping us understand who we are. And one of the things I'm always telling students is that you have to have self-awareness and understand who you are if you're going to be working with other people. So even in good times, if it makes sense for us to seek counseling, it certainly makes even more sense in times as crazy as this for us to really understand who we are in working with people who are in intense pain, dealing with everything that has to go on, that they're dealing with in their lives. And dealing with this intense pain constantly is going to get to us. So it is really crucial that we get counseling. It's something that we should do anyway, so it just makes sense in times like this.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other panelists?
Oh, go ahead, Gerald Corey.
Go on, Ebony, you go.
Thank you. I don't think I'm adding anything new to the conversation, but we know studies show how trauma is stored in the body, and that's not just primary trauma, right? And so right now, particularly during this time, even though I agree with Dr. Lee, that even when things aren't as chaotic as they are now, but particularly during this time, it's so important that we have an outlet, because counselors are secret keepers, and there's information that we can't share. And so it's stored inside of us. And so we need that outlet. Particularly when you're working with populations who are always constantly in a chaotic time or dealing with collective trauma, and you're constantly receiving those messages. So you need to have an outlet to not only maybe process all the pain that you're holding for other people, but even your own pain that you're experiencing as well.
Thank you so much. Dr. Corey.
You know, I always tell students, and I hope we have a lot of students in this program, that the most important thing you could probably do is get into your own counseling, because the theories are important, the techniques are important, but your relationships are what are crucial. So the more work you can do on yourself, I think the better. And I think we should always be open to ongoing counseling when we need it, and not say, well, I'm old enough, I should have all my stuff in order. At least, and it doesn't always have to be a professional counselor. Sometimes we can seek a colleague who's a good friend, and that could be very therapeutic. So I hope we don't see therapy as always a 50-minute hour, and we can get our colleagues involved in this. You know, Irvin Yalom has given keynotes at ACA, and sometimes they'll say, Dr. Yalom, do you have any advice for the people in the audience? And he says, yes, get in your own counseling. And then he shares that he's been in a group for 30 or 40 years, and he's 90 almost, I think 89. So if it's good enough for Irvin Yalom at 89, I suppose it's good for us young folks to kind of think about at least being open to that. And not thinking we're finished products. I think we always are a work in progress, and I think we ought to be thinking of how can I keep my instrument tuned up.
Definitely, definitely. Dr. Isnaga.
If I could just add that we are not immune to everything that's going on around us, and it's okay for us not to be okay sometimes.
Thank you so much, so much. Dr. Singh?
Well, and you know, I want to call our whole panel in, maybe to even share stories about when we ourselves have sought counseling, because I think one thing we have not done a great job as a profession is we'll say, yes, everyone should go to counseling, but we don't often tell the stories of when we sought counseling, and to really break the myths. It's been very important for me. I work with people who have loads of trauma, queer and trans folks of color, folks dealing with immigration and asylum issues. And it hurts, it's painful, it's wounding. And so, it's been very important for me to stay in counseling, to come back to counseling, to be connected with counselors. For me, as a light-skinned person of color, someone who can understand historical and racial trauma over generations. So I really, I hope we can keep having this conversation about a deeper level of what it's like to talk about being in counseling and to be vulnerable and to say we don't have the answers. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but in the hashtag pandemic, my inner kid is freaking the heck out. I mean, it's like, hey, is this ever going to end? And, you know, I have a lot of epidemiologists in my life. I do a lot of National Institutes of Health funded work. And, you know, they're like 2022. You know, this is about a long haul of us figuring out, not only is this pandemic giving some of us with lots of educational and financial advantage a time to pause and really reflect on, you know, that thing that has been knocking at our door and saying, hey, you haven't been looking at me. Like, actually, I'm a part of you that needs some healing. I know that our community is feeling this because when I've been out on the streets protesting, or whether I'm in a classroom or whether I'm sitting across from a client, people are experiencing this. So I think I just really want to put it out there that, you know, I myself have had to increase my frequency of counseling and go back and surrender and be on my knees. Like, you know, this is a lot. This is a lot to take in. It's a lot to hold, and it's not going to end anytime soon. And, you know, I even start to like flip out a little bit thinking about that, but really having the deep self-care practices and relational practices that are going to help us through. So I'd love to hear from my fellow panelists about when you know, because when we go seek counseling as counselors, you know, we got some high expectations and we might not even be able to find the person that's right. I know it took me a long time as a queer person of color to find someone who got all those intersections.
Thank you for sharing that. And there was a question in the chat that actually refers right to that. And says, how can we as counselors seek counseling in ourselves? And so maybe to piggyback off of what you just shared in terms of our own experiences, also kind of share how we are asking our counselors in training and our counselors who are in the field to seek counseling for themselves, or counselors for themselves. And I think you really started us off really well with that. So Selma, I see you shaking your head.
Well, I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that we have so much more access now. I live in a relatively small community, and I've been a counselor educator for 20 years. And so I have trained and supervised a good many of the counselors in our community. And so I've been able now to go outside of my community in telemental health and find a counselor that doesn't know me, and doesn't have any preconceived notions about me, and get to do some real work and some kind of cleansing of the soul so that I can come back to my students and be the whole person they need me to be.
I think sort of tied in with this is something that I've talked about a lot over the years. I spent a lot of time in the UK looking at counselor training there. And part of counselor training in the UK is your own personal counseling is mandated as part of your training. You know, in this country, we strongly recommend it, strongly suggest it. I really wish that we could get to a point where as part of student training that they have to do their own counseling. I've had students basically who I've recommended their own counseling to, and they say, what, I don't want to go to counseling, but yet they want to be counselors. So I think for a lot of students, we've got to get them beyond that stigma that they're still attached to counseling, and to get them to see how ridiculous that sounds, considering that they're going into the profession and they want other people to be vulnerable and open up, and they're not willing to do that. I want to pick up on Jerry Corey's point for a minute about the informal counseling, because that's been so important to me throughout my own life in difficult times. Not necessarily, I mean, yes, I want, in all honesty, I want to see a Black male counselor if I wanted to see it. That's kind of hard to do because there's not a lot of folks who look like Dr. Butler and myself, unfortunately, in the profession. So I've found other ways to get counseling, and one of the most powerful experiences that I have, and I look forward to, literally, is going to the barbershop. Because when I go to the barbershop, I can vent and talk about all the crap that goes on at the university with people who don't know this world at all. and it's really freeing to do that. So I just wanted to underscore that notion of, yes, there are professional counselors, but we need to look also at community sources of help that people have used for generations that really precede professional counseling.
You know, Cortland, I was getting ready to say just before you started that one of the best experiences of my counselor education program when I was going through, which is many seemingly centuries ago now, was that we were required to go to counseling. It was not a suggestion. It was a requirement of some of our core courses, like group counseling, individual counseling. So we were required to go. So we didn't have the option of saying no. And exactly what happened, exactly what you're saying, experiencing it is different than teaching it. And you can't walk in somebody's shoes sometimes unless you at least walked in half of theirs in order to have an empathetic moment with the person. We teach the difference between empathy and sympathy, but we don't always talk about necessarily what it really means to empathize with somebody and to have actually walked in their shoes and feel what they feel. And so I agree that we do need to get to a point where our students are required to take counseling, because I think they would think of it differently if they have had at least the experience. And when you have the experience, when you don't necessarily think you need it, you approach it differently than when later you actually do need it. And I will say that as a chronologically gifted person in a pandemic time where I am now working in a space in my house that's kind of my woman cave, that was my office, that when I did it, I absolutely loved this space. I mean, I loved this space. And now I've reached a point where if I could torch it without hitting the rest of the house, I would probably do that, because I'm here 12 to 15 hours a day. But saying that, I have had to find ways to get around that. And these are suggestions that I have made to others. And telecounseling has been something that has been a part of my recent life. I neglected to say I'm a dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at Coppin State University, as well as a counselor educator. And I'm now telecounseling, and I have been a school counselor. So I have been in multiple field areas of our profession with multiple populations within our profession. And I see that as extremely important. And then the last thing I wanted to say about this was, I was also going to say, I had a student in a rehab counseling program who was coming back to get a certification, but she had been a beautician in her former life before she went back to school. And she is actually marrying the concepts of beauty parlors and counseling. And she is now she has her own private practice. But you are absolutely right, Cortland. Is not, even though we teach cultural competency and we should all be able to deal with any client with whom we are faced, people do prefer certain people at certain times for certain reasons. And a beauty parlor is a fabulous place to be able to have conversations that you may not have with others, especially in her case with a person who's actually trained. Now, I'm not saying you're going to go find a person who's actually a counselor, an actually licensed professional counselor who also owns a beauty parlor, but she is one. But it has been a wonderful thing for her clients.
And if I can add, and I hate to be the odd woman out, but I do want to drive that point home more that Dr. Singh brought up, Dr. Lee and Dr. O'Brien, spoke about. Yes, I do agree that counselors should be required to receive counseling in their training, and also should seek counseling outside of that once they've achieved their training as well. But I also want to recognize, as has been put in the chat, as some of you have spoken to, that our counseling profession is still very white. Mm-hmm. And Helms and others have done research about how everybody prefers somebody who, even if they really can't relate to them, they perceive that they can relate to them because there's an experience there, a connection there that they need. And we have to be honest about the history of our country and the history of our profession and how Black people, as Dr. West Alatunji says, have been swimming in the pathology of white people for a really long time. And so it has been difficult to seek counseling when you feel like, okay, I'm going to be judged, or my family is going to be broken apart, or you're not going to see this as it really is. And I'm so glad that we're talking about, particularly in the African American community, spaces that have provided counsel and support, because one of the more concerning things that I've recognized for people who try to promote counseling in the African American community are them denigrating and dismissing things like church, things like barbershop, things like, you know, the beauty shop, and those collective spaces that have served us really well for a very, very long time. And there has been this message that, you know, kind of, you know, prayer isn't enough. Your pastor can't deal with this. And I recognize that people go to school and they get trained for a lot of things and have expertise, but the way to get people, particularly Black people, to go to counseling is not to disparage the spaces, the only spaces where they have felt safe for so long. And so even still in 2020, because Dr. Singh requested we talk about our own counseling experiences, right now, as a PhD licensed professional counselor, Black counselor who has a connection, a group of people who I'm connected to, I'm having trouble finding a Black woman counselor right now in this moment. And we have to speak to that. And yes, there are other counselors, and we have telehealth and things of that nature. And I can, you know, find a white man or a white woman or someone else in my community. But I don't want to have to go through that process of, oh, can I say, if I say ain't, am I going to be judged? If I, you know, talk about banana pudding, are they going to say I need to put that on my, you know, all these things that come up, particularly during this time. And so while, yes, I agree and I promote everyone seeking their counseling, I will be remiss not to say that they continue to be obstacles, particularly for people of color in our profession. And we can't address one without addressing the other piece.
I think one of the things that has been underscored by this pandemic that I've observed, certainly in my community here in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is one of probably the largest and supposedly most affluent African-American community in the country. I live here, but I'm not that affluent. Is how important the church, first of all, here in Maryland, African-Americans and Latinx populations have been disproportionately impacted by coronavirus. The death rate is all out of proportion to whites. One of the things that we have seen is the power of the Black church. And that's where people are looking to for guidance. First of all, the church is doing a really good job in terms of making sure people who have lost their jobs are getting food. But I've talked to so many people at a distance about how important their minister and their church is. So we've talked about this a lot, and a lot has been written in the literature about indigenous support systems. But certainly this pandemic has really underscored that we as a profession, because it is so white, we really need to pay more attention to how important these indigenous sources of help are.
Thank you for sharing that.
Comes back.
We had other questions, so I'll be brief. But one thing I'd love to see is a therapeutic group for students in counseling programs. At California State University, Fullerton, my university, they had a 1-unit course that wasn't graded, that was facilitated by somebody on the outside without evaluative power. And at first the student said, well, I don't know if I can be myself here. But then a lot of them said, we would like to see this going on throughout our entire program. So I think there's a lot of power in a group, particularly a therapeutic group, where students can learn how to bond and be a support for one another, rather than being in isolation. So I'd love to see therapeutic groups as a part of every single program, master's and doctorate.
Yeah, thank you. Sama.
I think one of the reasons that the social support groups in the communities have been so successful and so enduring and persistent is that they are accessible, and counseling is not always accessible, especially in communities of color. a lot of the people in my community see counseling as a luxury that they can't afford. And so another advantage of this time that we're living in is that we now have access to training programs in our states that are offering free counseling in addition for training opportunities for their students. And so I have referred my own students to lots of our great programs in Texas to say, here's a resource. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to leave home. You don't have to get childcare. Get the counseling that you need. And I would invite all of us that are counselor educators in the group to post your information so that everybody that's with us tonight can take advantage of that.
Definitely.
A really good point. You know, at Coppin State University, our rehab counseling program does provide pro bono counseling services, and they are linked with a community counseling source in the community, which means that those services are free to anyone and everyone, as well as to our own students, those who need disability support service or anything like that, just need counseling. And during this pandemic, it has been probably one of the most invaluable sources for our community, because many of our students at our HBCU are in fact themselves frontline workers while they're working their way through school. And they are young families, they have children, and it has been very, very difficult for them. And having those pro bono services, which is something they've experienced death more frequently, like Cortland was saying, the number of deaths, virtual funerals that I have been to now in the last 6 months is astronomical, and twice as much than I've been in my entire lifetime, which is significant thing to say statistically. And so having those services at our school has been an invaluable thing. And you're right, it is not always accessible, and it is not always free. And so it has made a big difference for us.
Thank you.
I worked briefly at North Carolina A&T State University, and one of the great things about the counseling center was that first-year students were required to go to counseling for 3 sessions, and it wasn't required that they have a specific mental health concern, just that they go meet with a counselor 3 times during the course of the semester. And I thought it was a wonderful way to destigmatize the process of counseling and to introduce African-American students to counseling as something that is worthwhile. And the great majority of the counselors in that office were Black counselors.
Yeah, I think it's really important to also recognize the tribe, right? And so when the counselors are not available to us, I know that for myself, I consult with my brothers who are also in the counseling field, who kind of support me through some of the things that I'm going through. And they can hear me when I say, you know, this just happened to me today. And so there's a couple of questions that were in the chat that I would like to kind of get you all to talk about. I'm going to combine them, and maybe you can think about it in that regard. So one of the questions was, how do counselors protect themselves during sessions? For example, a client refers to someone as Negro. How to handle this without not being ethical, right? That's one of the questions. And then the other question I would like to probably combine with that is, how do we handle a client's racism? And so how would you all like to tackle that?
I mean, we got to tell the truth.
Yeah,
thanks, Dr. Wright. I mean, like, you know, this goes back to the discussion we were having earlier in our counseling classes. We, you know, learned that certain, you know, basically white, Western, straight, cisgender guys started counseling. It's just not true. It started on the continent of Africa, where all humanity has, probably with a Black woman, and that's where all our DNA goes to, back to. So, like, I think, you know, if we get honest in our profession about where counseling actually started and how people have been engaged in mental health since the beginning of humankind in some way or another, then I think we can start to tell the truth about everything else that's happened in our profession. So anti-Blackness, you know, racism, sexism, all the intersections. And I mean, this goes back to our very first point contact point with clients. I don't know what your intake paperwork looks like on this panel, but mine looks like, hey, this is who I am, what we're talking about. And so in those moments where racism is going to come up, if I'm working with a white person, non-Black person of color, but also with Black and people of color communities where racism gets internalized, I have the end to say, tell me more about that, or set a boundary like, wow, like that ouch, that hurts. We need practices, and this is not mystery. This is stuff that we train ourselves in theories that have a group of practices, a conceptual framework. And of course, anti-racism is going to have a conceptual framework, but hell no, it's a boundary, and let's talk. And I think it goes without saying, but maybe we just need to say it, that, racism is a white people's problem.
One of the buzzwords in our profession today is broaching. And I think certainly if you hear a client use a term like Negro, it's incumbent upon you to broach that. And since counseling is supposed to be an educative process, that basically that term is not acceptable, and to educate them on what would be a more appropriate term. The other part of that, many years ago, I wrote an article on how to counsel a bigot. And one of the things that I remember writing about in that is, it's got to start with, you got to understand at some level, this is some mother's child. Believe it or not, this was at one time a little baby with, no knowledge of the world, and had to be carefully taught all this crap. So if they've been taught it, they could also unlearn it too. So again, through broaching and helping people to kind of take a look at where this came from, what it's all about, and really help them to, undo this racism. Now, do you want to do that? And I think that's the issue. Certainly ethically, in terms of what we talk about in terms of cultural competency, you need to be doing this. But you can't just let it sit there, because it's going to be like a dead elephant between you and the client. It's going to really, really eat at you, and you're not going to be effective as a counselor.
When you first asked that question, it took me back to when I first started counseling. And ironically, our collective reaction was silence, actually, before anybody said anything. And why that reminded me of my early days is I had a young man who he was clearly a person of a he came with swastikas all over his body. His head was shaved. He was clearly clearly had an identity of his own, and he came in that way. And I was taken back because I really wasn't sure, because he didn't want to be there, and I actually felt intimidated by him. And my first reaction was almost exactly like, what do I do with this? And it didn't take me long, though, before I realized that I had to deal with that. I mean, and I couldn't let it sit there. I wasn't going anywhere. There's no place for me to refer him to. I was a young counselor then. I was just beginning, and it really was a hurdle for me for about 10 minutes. And then after that 10 minutes, I found my sea legs, and I was off and running. And what was interesting was that this young man, to go to Cortland's point, this young man grew up in an environment where if he were not like that, he would not survive. And therefore, his mannerisms, his outer coverings, everything about him was about survival in the environment in which he lived. And as we got to know one another, and you talk about the skill of disclosing and knowing what to disclose in a counseling session, you find out that people are people underneath somewhere, and they have learned behaviors. And that changed the whole trajectory of my counseling behaviors and experience from that point on, because it knocked out the fear. It knocked out the inability to speak up for myself and say what I thought, find the right way to say it, because there is a right way and a wrong way to say it. And sometimes the way we say things are more offensive than what we said. And you have to find a way of saying things. So I think the term Cortland used was
Broaching.
broaching.
Yeah.
I think you just come right on out and say it. It's called broaching, that's fine. I find a different one, I need to find it, but I don't think it's something you put under the rug.
Definitely.
So, and I want to add to, starting off with what Dr. Singh says. She was saying we tell the truth. And I know that people are really familiar with the speech that Dr. King gave in '67 to psychologists, where he said that social scientists, they were fortunate to be able to basically destroy evil instead of invent it, and but even though they were uniquely positioned to tell the truth, they did little to do so, right? And so it's important that we tell the truth. I remember being in my master's program and I watched a video. Dr. Parham, Thomas Parham was in this video, and he talked about 6 characteristics of a good counselor, so basic characteristics. And the first one was genuineness, and the 4th one was congruency, right? And I know a lot of people maybe rely or lean on their theory with this, and in my theory, I am taught to be my authentic self, right? And that the biggest mover of change is not even a theory I use, but the relationship that I have with my client. And I think I am doing my client a disservice if I'm sitting here in double consciousness, if I'm having one conversation in my head and having a different conversation outwardly. So it's important to say, so I notice you use this term. How do you think I received that? How do you think that hit me? How do you think that impacts this dynamic, this relationship? It's important that we talk about that stuff. I've actually had a client, I work with mostly teenagers, who called me, and hopefully it's okay to say in the recording, who called me a nigger in the session. And so I had to sit there, and I'm not going to sit there and say, okay, she's a client, she's a person, let me see where that's coming from. The first thing I'm going to do is say, whoa, pause. What's that about? What's happening here? We have to address this, because the fact of the matter, and I really respect Dr. O'Brien's lens and perspective, but I think it's also important to talk about how when people of color are counselors, there's another layer of burden that's placed on us, particularly when we are in these transracial or I'll say transracial because I can't think of the right word, dyas, another layer there, because even though I could understand and empathize with this person's humanity and their need for survival, I'm also understanding that how they're choosing to survive is going against my survival. It's a direct statement against my own survival. And I think it's important that we understand and deal with it. But yes, certainly tell the truth, address it. Don't let it just sit there. It's your responsibility to manage the tension in the room.
Thank you.
You're absolutely right about that. And let me say that maybe the rest of my story is I did have to be my authentic self, because I am a Black woman. That's exactly what I was, talking to a white man who thought it was okay to act the way he did and say the things that he said. And I did have to, for me, now this was a different era. For me, it was intimidating.
Right.
What I'm saying to you is that intimidation lasted for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, because now that's part of my DNA, because of the way my parents raised me. But
right.
There's certain things you just can't let go. It's a matter of finding the right way to do it.
But the textbooks in our instruction in our courses sometimes tell us that we need to not be our authentic self.
Mm-hmm.
Come to and be there for our clients, meet them where they are. So talk about that. Talk about how do we not dismiss what our ethical obligations are, but also recognize that there are teachable moments in our counseling sessions with our clients when they are doing things that go against who we are as individuals. Because in all of that, we should not be walking away from someplace feeling as though we have been shamed or we have been disappointed or we have been hurt by the words that somebody said, and I can't speak back to that because they're our clients. So what are some of your thoughts?
Well, you just used the operative phrase, teachable moment. And if part of counseling is supposed to be an educative process, there are many times in counseling relationships that are teachable moments that I think many times counselors sort of skip by. So when you have a teachable moment, you take it, particularly on something as explosive as this. If it's going to really attack your personhood which it does, if somebody's going to call you the N-word or some other, derisive term, you can't just let that slide by. You've got to broach it, use that term again, and use that as a teachable moment.
Right. I think we can be authentic and still be respectful. So I think a counselor can say, what I'm hearing you say is, lots going on with me, and let's talk about this. So I don't think we can be confrontational and still be respectful of that, always, even though it's tough, even though it's difficult. And that's where afterwards, we need to seek out a colleague or a supervisor or a therapist and debrief and talk about our own feelings that are stirred up with some very difficult clients at times. So
I'll ask you this question because it came through. So does there come a time when we separate from that racist client, or do we work through it?
So I want to say that counseling is educative, but it's also relational, right? And so we're sitting in a relationship, and your words affect that relationship, and they affect me. And I cannot be in this relationship unless I am my authentic self. So I need you to know how your words have affected me. And we also model for clients how their behaviors affect all the people in their world. So we have that responsibility to do that reality testing for people. So you're talking to me in this way and it's affecting me, and I'm going to share how it affects me, where other people in your life may just walk away from you, or they may hit you, but they may not have this conversation with you. So we have that opportunity to stay in it, in that room, in that space, and both grow from that.
Excellent. Other thoughts?
And I also wanted to add that for many theories, confrontation is a part of the process. So just start, right, Dr. Corey, your textbooks, and even what I use, rally therapy based on African principles, confrontation is actually a therapeutic tool that we can use. How can we address if we don't confront? And so I'm showing my theory a little bit.
The elephant in the room, we address it. Dr. Singh, you were going to say?
Well, I think this comes back to what we're dealing with right now, and we have in the counseling profession for a while in our practice, our teaching, our supervision, education, all of it, is that we're in a racial reckoning, but white folks have been woken up to kind of reckon with this. I mean, we know what theories would tell us to do if they're, the Johari window and all that. Like when someone's saying something and we're like, whoa, like it's not that we're the expert and we're working with this stuff and trying to get them to some place. We're working with awareness in the room. We're working with the client's goals. But if we haven't been clear from the very jump about what counseling is to us, what our values are, what's on our intake paperwork, what people can think about and expect when they're seeking counseling, we're going to constantly end up in these situations. And I know we have stories here and there about, of course, BIPOC counselors experiencing racial microaggressions, but we just know there are numerically more white counselors who are working with numerically more white clients saying this shit. And so I would love to see us, and especially in this current moment of racial reckoning with anti-Black racism, all the forms of it, that we build this muscle more about being able to tell the truth and to say how it hurts and really lean into the relationship. We do it we train ourselves to do this with every single other counseling topic that people bring in. But this is, I think, where we fall short in our multicultural competence, right? I mean, all those competencies were originally really a focus of, how to train white folks to work with folks of color. And,
Right.
Anyway, I could go off on this for a while, but we need to reckon with this.
Yeah.
I think this is also a cognitive behavioral moment because I have always considered myself a Kodak moment from everything that I do, because people are always looking at you, rightly or wrongly. They're judging you, they make assessments about you before you've opened your mouth. And so I once remember having a colleague say, how when someone goes to do something and they want you to do good, and they'll say, good luck or break a leg. And I came back from delivering what I delivered. My colleague, my good friend said, "You really did do well." So his expectation was never that I was going to do well. His expectation that because of who I was going to do less than well. And
Right.
so I think that in this particular moment, we have more people watching than ever before. Things that used to be covert are now overt. And so we're all going through a period of, oh my God, what happened? I mean, we're all overloaded, but it's at the same time an optimal moment to teach a lot that's being taught. When I think about the fact that the population now knows that there are very few, if any, Black parents that never said to a Black son when they go out to get in their car to go someplace, "Don't ever forget you're a Black man driving," wherever it was. And now that's something they literally did not know. And there's,
And 46 seconds.
oh, sorry, I'm done. They
No,
didn't know,
no,
and now
that
they,
wasn't, I was saying that 8 minutes and 46
oh, 8 minutes and right.
open
That
to society.
I think that it's so critical when I think of all the years of all these years. And one of the things that's so significant even about this Black Lives movement is that it is a coalition of multiple people and multiple colors of faces that are out there. It's not that we haven't been saying this for years and years and years. I was there when Martin Luther King made his first speech. And now I'm seeing a different population, even though there were mixtures even then, the diversity is far different than it was then. And the people have a better understanding and a knowledge of what hell people have been through all these years, and it makes a difference.
So that's a good segue into this question. And Dr. Sho, I know you have something to say, but let me ask this question and see if you can piggyback off of this. So so this person is saying that they're struggling with the political climate as it is today. They feel attacked by the presidential administration that's currently in the office. How do I continue to hold hope for my clients when I feel like I'm drowning?
So I think something that that gives me hope is the story of Derek Black. I don't know if you know Derek Black's story. He was the leader of a white supremacist group called Stormfront. And he was sort of like inherited the mantle from his father, and he was also related somehow to David Duke. And what happened in his, he attended a college called New College in Florida, a liberal arts college. That's a very good college. When the student body found out who he was, that he was this white supremacist leader who had somehow entered anonymously their midst, I would say 98% of them ostracized him. But there was a small group of Jewish students who said, we believe that there's someone underneath that exterior, you know, that facade that we can get to know. They befriended him, and they had weekly dinners with him, and they worked really hard to refute all of his white supremacist beliefs that had been drummed into him since he was a young child. And they succeeded in turning him around. And you can see him now on talk shows talking about how these students successfully presented data and counter arguments to chip away one part at a time until he was transformed.
So you're going to send those students to Pennsylvania Avenue? Is that what you're saying?
No.
So I would like for you all to kind of consider that in terms of, you know, the thing that I used to do. I did teach about the young man, and to be saddled with that last name, and to know that everywhere you go, how you treat people, you have that last name. And so I was like, well, that's a little irony there, a joke that we have to deal with, thinking about teaching about what this man's way has been. So, but going back to how people are feeling about the current climate, people are exhausted and tired, and they're dealing with their clients with regards to all these things, but yet they still have to deal with their clients. So, and all of that. So what kind of responses do you have to this person who says that they're drowning?
Well, one of my more immediate thoughts is sometimes you have to find a way to step away. You know, they tell you on a plane, when that oxygen mask comes down, you put it on yourself first before you put it on your children or anybody else, because you can't help them if you can't breathe. And honestly, we have got to find ways to step away. That does not mean that we're being derelict in our duties. It means that we have to find ways of replenishing ourselves in order to move forward more effectively. And that replenishing doesn't have to be that long. I mean, it can be all sorts of things, from taking a phone call or a meeting outside in the sunlight to getting up and walking around your office, not staying in there 12 to 15 hours a day. There are lots of ways to do things. We need to turn off the news. I was an MSNBC junkie. Now I'm a Hallmark Channel guru, because I can't take that much more of it. And there was a time when I used to look at, for instance, I would look, since the channels have become so polarized and political, I did try to look at channels that are opposite of what I believe, because I wanted to try to understand what other people are hearing and understand their perspective. I can't take it very long, but it was enough for me to at least hear another point of view other than one that I'm always hearing. And it helps me deal with people that sometimes I have to confront differently, and I'm less affected because I'm learning to Teflon myself in some ways. And then lastly, I'm gonna say there's one thing I've done which is almost ridiculous. Well, no, I'll say that for later. That's it.
My new words to live by come from the Roman poet Ovid. In 2,000 years ago, he wrote, "Take rest. The field that has rested gives a beautiful crop." And those are the words I live by now. I go fallow like a field does. And every day I'm saying to myself, take rest. And I think that should become our new mantra, take rest, and really sort of prioritize what is really important in life today. As many of you know, 4 months ago, my wife passed away very suddenly. This is an extremely difficult time in my life personally. But one of the things that this has taught me, along with all the craziness that's going on in the world, is what is really important and what isn't.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I have learned that's really not important is sitting all day in front of a computer or having my phone in my hand all day long. And I take rest now, and I only do the things that I think are important to me, which is one of the reasons why I'm here tonight. This was important to me. If it wasn't, I wouldn't be here, because I don't do things anymore unless they really have some meaning in my life. And I think from an existential point of view, that's what we have to help our clients understand. What really gives you meaning? What's really sacred in your life? Given all that's going on, given the toxic political climate that we're in today, what really is sacred and what really gives you meaning? And take rest is really important.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Shelley, like you were going to say something.
Just to piggyback on what Dr. Lee was saying, you know, there's a lot of importance in being. There's a Western emphasis on doing, and this bias that it's not important unless you're doing, unless you're achieving. But a part of rejuvenating and recharging is being content with the state of just being.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And I'm just going to plug counseling one more time,
Very good.
because, you know, I really appreciated Dr. O'Brien's point, and then Dr. Lee's, and of course, Dr. Scholl's. But I'm reminded of Audre Lorde's quote about caring for yourself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. And I know for many people, we have been socialized to take care of others first. And so, you know, Dr. O'Brien kind of reminded us about, you know, what they say on the plane, you know, how does somebody who has been indoctrinated and socialized to always look out for others first, how do they be okay and sit with taking rest and taking care of themselves? Because typically we only take those moments of rest when we're hit with some type of event that puts things into perspective for us. And I just want to plug counseling, because even if you don't know how to do that, you can learn how to do those things, not just in counseling, but in the spaces that have been safe for you as
So,
well.
so we got a question from someone who talks about rest being our resistance or helping in terms of resistance. Can you all talk a little bit more about what that rest looks like for you, and maybe some tips or things that you would like to share with our public here about what that rest?
I'll be happy to. Dr. O'Brien shared some things for her. I'm an avid reader. I read, and I try to read stuff that doesn't relate to the profession. I'm always amused by people who the only books they read are psychology books or counseling books. I read historical novels. I read mysteries. I read the Spencer series. I read stuff that basically is going to take my mind completely out of my profession. I've watched some really good stuff on Netflix. There's crap on Netflix, but there's some really good stuff on Netflix. My dog, who is hopefully you can't hear him snoring, he's behind me here. I spend quality time with my dog every day because he's all I've got at this point. He's my best friend at this point. And he and I go across the street to the woods every single day, and I let him chase deer, and I just walk and reflect. And when I come back, I feel a whole lot better. One of the things that I think we all know is we're kind of stuck in our places, and every day is pretty much like every other day. I mean, most of us don't know what day of the week it is anymore. Weekends don't really mean anything.
Amen.
So it's really important that, yeah, you do your work, you're productive, you do the things you have to do, but you've got to find ways to take rest, and you've got to prioritize what is important and what isn't.
You know, this is where I think self-care is not a luxury. It's not a nice thing. It's an absolute necessity if we're going to really care for others and do quality work. I think it's impossible to be competent in our work, whether we're teaching, whatever professional endeavor we have, if we're not taking care of ourselves on all fronts, not just physically. I'm sold on that completely. We're bodies and we need to attend to that. My Pilates instructor has a bumper sticker and it says, if you don't take care of your body, where will you live? If you don't take care of your body, where will you live? And I like
now,
that.
if people who are not on this panel and listening in, they would not know that Gerald Corey does Pilates.
Oh, I do. And I used to do group Pilates and groan and grunt and cuss. But now with the pandemic, I'm too uptight about going into a closed room with 6 other people. But I still do. I have a private, any rate, I think the main thing I want to say is there's always time for it. I think we have to make it. And it doesn't have to cost money either. There are so many things we can do, like Cortland, you walking your dog. You come back and you're refreshed. That doesn't cost money. And I think that's every bit as important as, doing things professionally. So I think we need to, and I love your point, Cortland, about finding meaning in life. You know, we ought to ask ourselves that question often. What am I doing that makes me want to go on? And I think we're holistic beings, so I think we need to take care of ourselves physically, emotionally, socially, spiritually, cognitively, and it's possible. And we don't have to be perfect at it. We can do it imperfectly, but at least I'm hoping that we'll all look and see, if I really care about others, I'm going to do what it takes to take care of myself so I can provide good care for others. Because how can I give you anything if I'm empty, if I'm empty well? And I'm fortunate to be productive in my life at 83. And I couldn't be productive if I didn't have stamina. And I think it's paying off that I make self-care a priority. I put it number 1. I think it's very important. And I think, go ahead. stuff, but I think it can be fun. And I think that's part of self-care too, enjoying life, recreating, doing something to recharge our batteries, connecting with our colleagues in a personal sort of way.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And Elise.
Yeah, I mean, I want to go back to that Audre Lorde quote Dr. White called into the room because it's a powerful one. Audre Lorde was speaking to Black lesbian women. And I think this is such an important, and of course that, you know, has meaning for so many other folks, but this is a moment right now of self-care where we can actually unlearn oppression. I think it's a liberation moment. I think liberation is the value maybe we were all working for in counseling, is getting free, all of us. And I think part of getting free in this moment, again, it comes back to telling the truth. When I'm sitting with clients, I'm like grieving as I'm counseling. I don't know in any moment how we're not doing that, but on this moment, it's just like at a level 10. And so, you know, I think Dr. Lee was talking about his personal walk in grief, and I appreciate you sharing that vulnerability here, because when you lose a partner, you have that, you know, you're way more awake to life, you know. And I think in this pandemic, we're all grieving. And so we're a little more awake, but then, you know, whiteness, you know, cisness, straightness, like all those privileges just add up to who can care for themselves, you know, who has money, who has shelter. I mean, I'm in New Orleans, a shit ton of people are about to get evicted. I'm really conscious of how I get to have shelter over my head. And then at the same time, I do really try to pause and look at nature and be taught by nature and the big oaks in New Orleans. But that's been a walk I've been on right now, which is, you know, who gets to care for ourselves, and, you know, what is the obligation we with multiple privileges have to expand that ability for other folks.
Yeah, thank you. Selma, you were going to say something.
Yeah, one of the things that I've learned is that wellness doesn't just happen. It takes discipline. I am not there yet. I cannot wait to take rest, Dr. Lee. Unfortunately, I'm a workaholic and I have a really hard time disengaging. So for me, wellness takes discipline, and it has to be a deliberate act. I have to plan for it. Dr. Corey mentioned a lot of elements of wellness. It's not just about our emotional selves, but it's also about our financial status and our spiritual selves, our physical selves, our intellectual selves. And though we have to pay attention to all of those parts, but it takes planning and it takes discipline. So yeah, for anybody that's thinking, I'm not well and I can't be well, yes, you can, but you're gonna have to work at it.
Work at it. Thank you for sharing that. And just so everybody knows, there are some things that are in the chat that Dr. Corey has provided, and I believe there will be other things that the panelists will be providing for you all in regards to self-care. But I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you all a question from the audience here that says, how do I, as a white counselor, respect the historical racial trauma when it comes up without coming across as me? Or let me reread this question. How do I, as a future white counselor, respect the historical and racial trauma when it comes up without coming across as if I know how BIPOC people or clients feel?
Can you say it one more time?
How do I, as a future white counselor, respect the historical and racial trauma when it comes up without coming across as if I know how a person of color feels?
Okay, let me rephrase that, because it's a white person who is a future counselor, not a future white counselor, because they're already white. They're not going to be white in the future. So
no, there you go.
Yeah.
Yes. Teachable moment.
Yeah, teachable moment.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Lee, and you're going to want to do it anyway, but I would love to hear a white person respond to that question, because I often feel like it's always the people of color's responsibility to do that. But Dr. Lee, that's just my thoughts.
Well, let me start, and we'll see if our white colleagues want to fill in. I think part of it is just being able to listen. If we're counselors, we have to be able to listen to people's stories without putting judgment on it and just listening and trying to understand. The other thing that's really important is before even going into that, one of the things that it's really important for all of us to do, but I think it's really important for white counselors is to really understand history and understand history in the true sense, to understand as much as they possibly can, if we're talking about African Americans, let's say, the 401-year experience of African Americans in this country, as well as what preceded it in terms of the whole African diaspora. But that's important, but I think the first step is to listen. So I'll shut up and invite our white colleagues if they want to share something.
I'll go ahead and just say, I think an important aspect of that is exactly what the person indicated in their question, admitting that there are limits to your ability to put yourself in that person's shoes, that you can understand it on an intellectual level, but not a phenomenological level. You can't say that you truly have experienced exactly what they've experienced, and to show cultural humility and indicate that you are open and accepting of having someone share their knowledge with you so that you can understand more fully their experience.
I like what you said, Cortland, very much about really listening and not coming in with judgments or an agenda. And I'm going to probably be touched if I listen to you, and I don't have to go into history, but if I'm affected and I have empathy, I think it's perfectly important to share that and let you know as a client how you're affecting me and how I'm touched by what I'm listening to. So I think we should be open to the stories of our clients, and there's a lot of common ground too, even if we don't. And I'd never want to say, and I hope counselors don't say it, oh, I know exactly what you feel, because we don't. We can strive to have some understanding, but that's always imperfect. But I think listening and responding with empathy, if it's there, and care and compassion is what it's about.
I would also say that as a white person who will be becoming a counselor, in your counselor education program, you've started to talk in the multicultural counseling courses about cultural competence, and you've heard the words awareness, knowledge, and skills. And if you think about the fact that it is a spiral process and that you are always becoming, but if you are not aware in the first place, you will never become knowledgeable or skilled in any of them. And the awareness starts with listening, all the things that we've just said, but there is an implementation process to the process of becoming culturally competent. And it's not that everybody always gets there, but we're always becoming that. But you have to be aware in the beginning. I would say that your question speaks to the fact that you are aware that there are things that you need to be doing and listening. And when you become aware, then your next step will be knowledge, but you will never work. And even when you start to go into knowledge, you're still always becoming aware, because it's always something that you're going to become aware of. Like I was referencing before, after all these years, people are finally understanding what Black parents have said to their Black children as they go out into a white world. That's an awareness that has never been there for many, many people until now. So those types of awareness are always going to be becoming. So
yeah, thank you for that. Dr. Isnaga, you were going to say something?
Yeah, quick parentheses about history. I was an adult before I realized that the history that I had been taught in school was the perspective of the hunter, not the lion. So a good place to start is Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. That was my first big eye opener, and I haven't looked back since.
Yeah, thank you. And so we're not asking any of the questions that I sent you all. So here we go. The next question for you all is, for those of us who work in institutions run by people who are not of color, how do we begin, then continue the conversation of racism and institutionalized racism?
Can you repeat it one more time, the beginning part?
For those of us working in institutions run by people who are not of color, how do we begin to continue the conversation and institutional racism?
I have some things to say about this. Okay, so I'm a professor and just became Chief Diversity Officer at Tulane University, my alma mater in New Orleans. And so I think one of the things that I've noticed, and it was something I noticed when I was at the University of Georgia too, and also when I was in community-based practice settings, is that when there are white folks kind of in charge and leading, there can be this kind of multicultural competence around we need to serve BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color's needs. Like we need to do more. We need to do more. Yes, yes, yes. But I think in those instances, like people's eyes turn away from whiteness, and then whiteness constantly gets invisibilized, and it's constantly in every single decision. And, you know, I mean, race does not exist out, you know, only for folks of color. You know, it just doesn't work that way. So I think what the work I've been leading a lot is getting, you know, white cisgender straight men to pause. And I'm using all my counseling skills. You know, do we notice who's in the room right now and who's not in the room and who's making the decision? This is a white male cis heterosexual perspective. And how do we feel about that? You know, are we okay with that? And so, and then using data, I think, you know, if we've done our good advocacy and multicultural social justice competency, we know using data is huge at making change. I mean, you can look at, we know what happens with COVID deaths and contraction, what the spikes look like and how we want to bend the curve. You know, we know who's dying, who's getting infected, but, you know, with whiteness and kind of policies that continue to support white people being in charge, it's always going to look like this. You know, it's not going to be a curve that's going to spike, you know, until we really get very intentional about planning equity indicators and saying we really want to make a difference, which means usually looking at whiteness and visibilizing that. So we got a long way to go if we actually want to change who's in charge, and it means giving up some power. It doesn't mean just sharing power. It's like whiteness naming itself over and over and over again.
Okay, thank you. Any others?
I was just going to offer that my daughter works in one of the top 8, she's a director for HR in one of the top 8 accounting firms. And it is all white. And there are very few persons of color, especially at her level. And our current environment has been the impetus for the organizational power of this organization to actually bring folks together very differently than all the 15 years that she has worked there. And without going into everything they do, I would just say that I think that this current time that we're in is a prime teachable moment to introduce things that we may not have had the heart, the will, or the opportunity, or even the impetus to say something about, because it would have been cast aside. We're at a very fertile moment where I think we can suggest things in white corporations that would not have been accepted before. There are a number of diverse people who would go along with some of the things that we might suggest doing. And I think that watching what's happened at her firm has been very encouraging, because it's been very encouraging. So I think that even though she's not an institution, I think that worldwide, when you think about the fact that Black Lives Matter is not talked about just in the United States.
Yeah.
It is a worldwide phenomenon now. So,
that's why I think we are at an inflection point that I have never seen. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And that was yes, Dr. O'Brien.
I think me too, that's all.
No, I know, well, I wasn't going to say it, but this is much different than the 1960s. the 1960s opened the door, and I mean, we made tremendous progress. But the kinds of things that I have seen this time in this era are amazing. Like things I never thought I mean,
Right.
you know, things like, you know, taking down Confederate monuments and talking about changing the names of things. Here in Washington, D.C., one of the things that we cannot believe is the fact that the name of our football team, which was an offense, is changing. I mean, true, it was because money talks and, you know, sponsors were going to move, you know, pull their money out.
Right.
But the owner of the team, who said he would never change the name of the team, the team has no name now.
You have no name.
It has no name. It's the Washington football team. I never thought
And no
that.
game either. So let me stop.
Okay.
Ignore what he just said.
I'll just leave that one
I will,
alone.
because I'm a fan of the team, and I'm really happy that I can now talk about the team and I don't have to use that offensive name.
Right.
So it's beyond just a teachable moment at this point. It is a teachable moment, but it's an opportunity that we have had, that we have now, that we haven't had before. And I think we as counselors, particularly if we talk about ourselves being agents of social change and social justice, need to really get out there and fill that gap in terms of the learning gap.
Yeah. So let me just tell you that we have like about 20 minutes left with you phenomenal people. And so I'm going to ask questions and maybe just take one answer from each person on these questions, just so we can honor some of the questions that are here. I'm going to say this first one real quickly, and I'll answer it and then we're going to move on. It says, can a Black person ever work with a white client? For so long, that's all we ever had because of the stigma in our community. So yes, I'll just answer that one right off the bat. Yes, we can. We've been trained to do so, and probably much more efficiently than some of the white counselors who are working with white clients, because we're looking at all of them and their intersectionalities within that. So the question then becomes, can you give advice for students whose professors and texts don't address multiculturalism? Who wants to handle that one?
How about if you're a student, you can speak up in your class and say, you know, I think something's missing here, for me at least. Or if you don't want to take that courageous step in the class, you could always meet with the professor out of the class and say, you know, I'm struggling and here's how I'm struggling, because I think I don't hear anything about diversity in the class.
And if you don't do that, put it on your evaluation form. Most
and hope they listen. Right. So there's another question. If you live in a rural area and you're disabled, are there reputable online therapies that you can recommend? I'll just go ahead and say yes. And we're going to put them in the chat, and we're going to have opportunities for you all to understand what the telemental health kind of community has to offer. And we'll go from there. Dr. Singh?
And I think especially during pandemic, you've seen folks kind of connecting each other online in different ways on Facebook, and there are a lot of Instagram lives going on. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of reclaiming of terms, you know, a term that I was always taught was terrible, just CRIP, CRIP. I'm getting good at using that language and saying it. So I think there's been a lot of CRIP empowerment, a lot of folks creating new spaces, a lot of intersectional spaces. So it might go back to that conversation we were having before, specifically about BIPOC folks. Like, you know, I think people living with disabilities are creating their own counseling networks because it just hasn't been existing or affirming.
Okay. This question is, I'm a non-Black person of color. I have a lot of Black and brown colleagues who dismiss racism. Has anyone ever experienced this? And if so, what do you do about it?
Dismiss racism as, well, you don't know, as in...
It doesn't exist, right? You know, oh, you people don't really go through any of that.
Well, I've never experienced racism in my life, kind of thing. Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, see, I didn't understand that at all. Okay, well, if they're still,
This question has stumped you all.
and under, but I can't say that. I guess
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, because I'm also a non-Black person of color. And so if I'm understanding correctly, because I've had the experience of people saying you are not visibly a person of color, and so you must not experience what we experience.
Well,
And
there's a lot of times in our classroom situations where you have a person, you're trying to talk and get people to understand and have exposure to what's happening. And then you have a person who is a person of color who dismisses what you just said when you're trying to put forth information, right? So you're sitting there saying, this is happening to people. And then somebody discredits what you said, and everybody else in the classroom goes, yep, see, I knew that they have an agenda. I knew that they were trying to come and tell me that all these things are happening to Black people, and it's not really happening, right? Go ahead, Dr. Singh.
I mean, internalized racism is real. And so at the beginning of the panel, I think we were talking about what we were taught and what we weren't taught. And so it doesn't matter if we're white folks, if we're, BIPOC folks, we usually have had the same books and read the same things. So this is like my rant about our profession. Like, Dr. Helms gifted us all this theory of racial identity development for white folks and people of color, but yet we don't slow down and think about what racial identity development space we're in or what other people are. And then to know that we're gonna move through these spaces. And she talked about these things as schemas of glasses we put on and we see. And it's not like we stay in one place, right? I mean, when George Floyd was murdered, we weren't even thinking about Breonna Taylor unless we were in Kentucky or unless we were following, police murders of Black people and Black women specifically. And so, if George Floyd was your first experience, with like outrage against anti-Black racism and police brutality, you were probably in a certain stage of schema of racial identity development. Right. And we know from our literature that there are interventions that are needed. Yes. It's not that you just let that go, but you really think deeply about what those conversations are going to look like. And we're going to regress. I think about white racial identity development, that retreat, that pseudo disintegration that white people have. It's the most dangerous place for BIPOC people. BIPOC people die when white folks are in retreat. But for people of color, we've got the I don't trust white people space of our identity development too. And then we need to go into nourishing spaces. I think we've really got to start not only thinking about theory to use for other people, but to use it for ourselves as counselors.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you for sharing that. So what would you all do in terms of how do you handle guilt and having self-care and taking care of yourself when there are so many other people who are struggling and hurting?
I hope you would challenge the guilt and say, okay, I'm feeling guilty about taking time to have fun, but it's important to me to have a little opportunity for some fun. Or I'm feeling guilty about spending time with a friend that I haven't seen in a while. Maybe I'm on a Zoom because that's all I can do. And then if I feel guilty, say, where did I pick up that? And challenge it. And don't let the guilt stop you. I don't think guilt is something that's hopeless. I think we can go ahead and do what we want to do and need to do, even though we might feel a little bit guilty and say, well, I'm being selfish thinking of having some fun or exercising or whatever it is. Go ahead and do it and say, maybe talk to the guilt. Write in your journal about your guilt and maybe think about where did I pick up that? Probably from your church or somebody that said, don't think about yourself. And yet if we don't think about ourselves, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to really compassionately care for others.
And if I can just add, I've really learned this the hard way over the last few months, that life is really very short and tomorrow is promised to nobody. So you have to basically take care of yourself. And as I said, take rest. One of the things that I find is so amusing is people freak out when they see that little battery indicator on their phone getting low and they gotta run around and charge up their phone, or check engine light comes on the car and they freak out and they gotta go get the. But any of those telltale signs, physical or emotional signs in themselves, they ignore, which isn't an indicator of an intelligent person, is what it comes to.
Right.
I
And
wanted to just say
how far you are away from home when you realize you don't have your phone with you, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
make a decision, do I go back or do I keep going and not have the phone with me today?
And that becomes more important than your own physical, emotional, spiritual health.
Exactly right.
I have to admit, I did that one time. I came all the way back and got my phone. But what I wanted to say was, I wanted to say one thing to people who really can't, who really find it difficult to take care of themselves. Some of the young people who have young people at home who still have to do their jobs, who are still trying to figure out how to manage all of these things. And while this may seem nonsensical to some, but you know, I've had a lot of challenges hit me at this late period of time where, well, I'm fortunate enough to be able to work from home and still have a job, but there are a lot of people around me who don't have that luxury, and I've become the caretaker for a lot of people who are either ill, lost their jobs. I mean, I have a lot of appendages I didn't used to have, and I'm glad that I have them, but it has also caused a lot of stress. And I'm comparing that to people who may have little people or jobs that can't leave. And I honestly have found the need to take leave in order to do my job, in order to catch up, because I find myself way behind. And as an administrator, there's certain things I just can't not do. Of course, if I drop dead tomorrow, they'll have somebody else do it. But the point is, I got to get it done. And I find myself farther behind because I'm always dealing with the problems of other people, either a job or in my other life. So I actually have started taking leave that during the day, which means I do work things for my job when nobody's bothering me, and I can get things done, which means that in the evening, I have time to see my family, because like Cortland, tomorrow is not promised. We have lost I have lost so many personal friends and family in the last 6 months that I want to change my life because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so I'm taking the work time that I have. If you have leave, take it. And the leave means that you may be actually doing the work you would have been doing from 9 to 5 anyway, but it's done. You're no longer responsible for it, and you can move on and have a better evening afterwards. So that's one of the things that I really want to suggest.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with you the other day when you said that you actually have taken your leave time so that you can do the work on your leave. And so that's the kind of things that we're doing in this pandemic to try to satisfy other people. So here's a question for you all. Given today's political environment, I have to put this out there. As a Mexican-American woman, I feel like, okay, no, I'm sorry, my whole thing moved. I was trying to read from the chat and that just didn't work itself out in the way that it was supposed to. Good Lord.
You want me to read it? Given today's political environment, I have to put this out there. As a Mexican-American woman, I feel like we are in the gray zone between the black and white spectrum. Dismissed in a way. Some feedback, please.
Yeah.
As a Mexican-American woman, I can say that we don't have to fit anywhere. We can be our own shade, and we need to find our voices and make our own space. So that's something that I hear a lot also, that Mexican and Latinx people are not getting any attention. And there are some horrific things that are happening on the border, and it's our responsibility to make sure that all of you know about them, and that we make our own space.
Thank you so much for that. Any others? Anyone else want to respond to that?
Well, I like that idea of making your own space. And, you know, I'm part Native American, and the way I kind of make my own space is by seeking out opportunities like going to powwows and reading Native American literature. And it's not something that's easy to find, but it requires some research and some self-expression, and it's a creative educational process of empowerment.
Definitely, definitely. Dr. Singh?
And I think we've also got to learn, we've just got to be really honest. Maybe my theme tonight is tell the truth. Like, I think for non-Black people of color, we do benefit from anti-Black racism. You know, my dad came over from India in the 50s as part of the brain drain of India. You know, he benefited from the Black freedom fighters and the civil rights movement and all the allies and co-conspirators. Doesn't mean he wasn't called a terrorist or that he wasn't beaten. I mean, I saw that growing up. It's all true. I suffered all the racial trauma and then being mixed race and all that. I can own all that. I can tell the truth about all that. But I can also tell the truth about how I learned anti-Black racism, because who were you going to align with? You know, white folks or Black folks? It's a false lie that Black folks are on the bottom of white body supremacy, but that is actually how it was set up. And you just have to go learn your history of like Prince Henry and King of Portugal and learn how anti-Black racism started. So let's call Angela Davis's name again. Like, the oppression Olympics, they don't work. And we have to tell the truth about how anti-Black racism operates in all of our communities.
So I want to thank you all. We are coming up on probably the last 5 minutes of us being able to communicate today. And maybe this is not our last time having opportunities to do this with our community. But I wonder if each of you all can maybe take this question and answer it from your perspective. We talked a lot about self-care, and maybe there's some things that you also want to add to that. But is there anything else on your minds? Anything that came up for you tonight that you want to impart or provide to those who are listening that you feel is pertinent to this conversation? And then we're going to close out the evening. So what might you want to share while you have the platform?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead, Jerry.
Go ahead. No, I'll be good. I have found probably the most important thing is to reaching out to colleagues who are friends. And I've been very fortunate in nurturing that and seeking that out and not waiting till they coming to me. And I suppose I really want to encourage you to find friends and colleagues that can nurture you, support you, and challenge you, and that you can work with, you can co-teach with, you can co-supervise with, you can write with, you can hang out with, and go to for just talking about yourself and your struggles and your hopes and what is the meaning in your life. So I just want to underscore the importance and hope you'll reach out to your colleagues. And that doesn't have to cost anything.
Yeah, thank you.
This is a little bit off of what we've been talking about, but I think it's really pertinent. For years, one of my frustrations has been that our multicultural competencies, multicultural and social justice competencies, and advocacy competencies for most students and for many people in the profession have just been these documents that come from these ivy-covered walls. But over the last few months, those documents have become really alive and really have meaning for what we do as counselors. And I'm really so happy to see that. It's unfortunate that it took, you know, all hell breaking loose. But now, and talking with students, they see that, you know, this isn't just a piece of paper made up by Dr. Singh and Dr. Butler and other folks. This is some real stuff that's really important to me as a counselor. And I'm really grateful to see that suddenly the competencies, all of our competencies, the multicultural, social justice, advocacy competencies now they become living, breathing entities. And for that, I'm really grateful.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. Dr. Zenaida, any parting words?
In my community, a wonderful thing has happened. People are recognizing that they need help, and they're reaching out to counselors for the first time, really, at this level. And so we're trying to take advantage of this moment where we can show the country what we have to offer. And be a part of this destigmatization of mental illness and mental health. And so I would just encourage everybody to take advantage of this moment and teach people what we have to offer and how helpful we really can be in this time.
Thank you so much. Dr. White, teach us something.
So just really quickly, I wanted to go back to Gerald Corey's point in regards to a student asking about not seeing themselves reflected in the curriculum or other people of color reflected in the curriculum as well. And he says he encourages courageousness, and courageousness involves two things: fear and risk, because it's not courage if you're not fearful of something. And if you're fearful of something, that means there's a risk that you're taking. And so I encourage you, because I recognize the power differential there. I want to urge you to join a collective, because there's power in numbers, so that you're not just approaching this as a singular one person, but you're approaching that with a posse, if I can say that. And then lastly, for self-care, I will say this. Think about the bare minimum, right? Black Lives Matter, matter is the bare minimum. And I think 1% is the bare minimum for me. And I encourage all of you to, at least at the very minimum, dedicate 1% of your day to something that nourishes you and fulfills you. So that's 24 minutes. And so you are worth 1% of your day, whether that is for prayer, whether that is for dancing, whether that is for connecting, whether that's for drinking wine, whatever it is, you are worth that 1%.
You teach us. Thank you. Mark Show, Dr. Show.
Yes, I'm a big proponent of balance as a mental health ideal. So the idea of the Native American concept of a circle, and to sort of look at that part of the circle that represents your wellness and target that part of your circle that seems most depleted. So it could be physical, intellectual, emotional, or spiritual. And if you can just invest 15 minutes in that part of your circle, you can feel very rejuvenated from investing that 15 minutes. And also, I'm very anti power nap. I don't like, it's too much pressure. I think a nap should just be a nap. Don't multitask a nap. That's wrong.
Yes. Dr. Singh, come on, bring it home.
Well, I think, one of my favorite quotes I've been trying to live by during the pandemic is by Adrienne Marie Brown. And she says, the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that our very existence is an act of rebellion. And so this is our rebel time. This is our freedom fighting time. All the freedom fighting ancestors we have fought for this moment, for us to dream build. And I think that's what we're called to do in this moment.
Yeah. And so before I go to the last person, I will tell you that, there are some go-to people that have been mentoring me in my life, and Cortland Lee, others have just sold into me, and I am so blessed by them being here, and Gerald Corey and Selma and Annalise and Mark, Ebony. I contacted each of you all to come and to kind of sow into our community, because I feel like we needed this, and you all came through for me, and I appreciate you all so much. And another mentor of mine, Dr. Beverly O'Brien, bring us home. What do you have to share in terms of taking care of ourselves?
Well, two things. One, I want to say that everyone out here in the audience are professional counselors. And while we've been talking about teachable moments, there's a club, the women's club to which I belong, one of the few social clubs that used to be everything was always professional. And our mantra is, enjoy yourself is later than you think. And I have started to live that mantra, enjoy yourself is later than you think. And everything I do now is starting to be what I enjoy doing. And there are a lot of professional things that I enjoy doing, as well as social things. But this is also, I'm gonna go back to that teachable moment. I hope that we will continue to say who we are. We are professional counselors. We do have a body of knowledge and skills, and people have, over the years, they have taken every other discipline, and we know that we are a collective and we're allied disciplines, but this is a time where they're actually using the word counselor, and they're not talking about camp counselors and real estate counselors and dog counselors. They're talking about professional counselors. So I hope all of us will continue to say who we are and exert those skills, because we are Kodak moments every day. And this is a time where, as has been brought up so many times, that our skills are needed and we are being sought out, and in areas where they've never talked about it before. So we have an opportunity to jettison professional counseling to another height. And so while we're talking about this platform of self-care, talk about it and model self-care as a professional counselor, and say you are that. Enjoy yourself while you're doing it.
Thank everyone who's here.
Wait a minute. Can we do one more thing?
One more thing.
President-elect Butler, everyone in the chat box, our whole community here, can we pour into President-elect Butler, who called us, invited us into this space, and can we give him some support? You are, President-elect coming in, and we are so excited for the leadership you've given us, the way you've led our conversation. And if we could put some words of appreciation in the chat box for you. I know there are a lot of people that organized tonight, but I think you are you brought us together, and thank you. We need it tonight. And I hope you read all the comments in the chat box.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And it's not about me, and it's about us loving on ourselves and loving one another. And I just hope that you all will take that to heart in terms of what I think this organization means to all of us. And we couldn't get to all the questions tonight. We're going to do our best to answer them, whether it be individually or we put it out there on the ACA website. But I just want you all to know that you are important and you matter. And I know that we're dealing with Black lives right now, and we're dealing with this pandemic, and we are asking you all to kind of open up yourselves to see what's really happening in this world and be here for those of us who are suffering in our quiet little way, or even and those of us who are being a little bit boisterous about it. But love on yourself and love on us, and take care of yourself through it all. Dr. Pressman, thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing us to have this space. And I want to turn it over to you for last words. And one last thing before I do that. If you want to stay on to communicate, to continue the conversation, please do. We're going to take a 10-minute type of a break, but I would love to stay on and hear from any of you all who are out there who just want to continue this conversation and get some things off your chest and to practice your self-care on this Zoom platform. Sorry, Dr. Pressman.
No, that's okay. No sorries necessary. What a success. Let me just say that I've been a counseling practitioner for almost 40 years. One of the things that I love about being in the best profession in the world, Dr. O'Brien, is that I still have a lot to learn. And so I thank each one of you from the bottom of my heart, because what you did tonight was allowed me to have self-care just by listening to each one of you. So I really thank you. And I know that everybody else online, including the staff, all of the counselors, I'm just going to say for them, I want to express all of the appreciation to all of you, and to the thought, to the time, for being so unselfish with your expertise. Thank you. I know why you're here tonight, and I know how fortunate I am to have been here tonight. I think I'll remember it for the rest of my life. Thank you, and I mean it. So with that emotional message, let me just say that I want to remind everybody, let me get down to the business. I want to remind everybody that we are going to be contacting everybody who registered for the event, and that we're also going to be, this event was recorded, but you're going to have an opportunity to earn a couple of CEUs. And so we'll also be sending you some links to the resources that the panelists talked about. And I'll talk about my beginning remarks. As I said at the very beginning, we designed this event with you in mind. I hope you found it to be of help and that it provided some comfort in what many of us are experiencing, and I mean all of us. So thank you again for being here. Thank you for being part of a community that is working to make this world more caring and one that embraces social justice and is committed to the elimination of racism in all forms. I encourage you to keep at it. And at the same time, let's remember to take care of ourselves and for our colleagues. I hope and I wish that you are as happy as I am right now, and that you will continue your self-care, and you learned some of the words of wisdom from everybody on this panel. So thank you, and I think we're going to see a video now. So here we go.
Someone asked a question once of Martin Luther King. How long do you stay the course and drain the drain? When it seems evil's won and greed is on the throne, and you feel like the silenced voice in a wilderness all alone. How long? How long? He said to justice rolls down like water. Justice rolls down like water. Justice rolls down like water. And righteousness flows like a mighty stream. A little boy about 10 years old sits watching his TV. He's alone most every night till 2 or 3. Though his mama works 2 jobs, she still can't make ends meet. He sees the fat cats lying still, but they always go scot-free. He says, how long? How long? Till that justice rolls down like water. Till justice rolls down like water. Till justice rolls down like water. Now righteousness starts flowing like a mighty stream. Power, greed, and profit, they will never feed the soul. These 3 shovels have dug us a deep, dark hole. Bashing understanding and living one for all. And all for one is what it's gonna take for us to break this fall. Oh, how long? How long? He said to justice rolls down like water. To justice rolls down like water. To justice rolls down like water. And that righteousness starts flowing like a mighty stream.
Thank you all for being a part of tonight. We really appreciate you. We're going to take a 10-minute pause, a 5-minute pause. And those of you who would like to just come on and just have a conversation, please feel free to do so. I think that you'll have the ability to unmute your mic and also show your video if you want to come on in that capacity. And we'll see where this goes, but we want to be able to now just have the after party. This is the debriefing, so to speak, to be able to see where you all are at and what we might be able to do for you, maybe a little bit more personally than the panel discussion.